The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $80, and Vernon Hollis heard the laugh before he heard the sold. It came from the back of the tent, that laugh loud and wet and pleased with itself. The kind of laugh a man makes when he wants the whole county to know he would never be caught dead making the mistakes somebody else just made. Vernon did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the object sitting on the plank table under the yellow tent light, and he lifted one finger to the clerk to signal that yes, he was the man who had paid. The object was a railroad lantern, or what had once been one. Cast iron, frame, brass fittings gone green with age, and the glass globe missing, replaced at some point by a plate of steel welded straight over the opening where the light used to shine. Somebody had taken a torch to it and closed it up on all four sides. The top vent, sealed. The oil fount, sealed. The little door, where the wick would have been trimmed, welded shut with a fat, ugly bead that ran the whole way around like a scar. It weighed more than a lantern should weigh. Anybody could see that just from the way Vernon had lifted it earlier that morning to look it over. It sat on the table like a small black tombstone, and the crowd had already forgotten it by the time the next lot came up. The date was the 12th of April, 1986, and the place was the old Barlow farm out past the county road in a town called Reed's Junction in the flat green middle of southern Illinois. The Barlow estate had been sitting untouched for 11 years, ever since the last of them had passed, and now the bank was clearing it out lot by lot, so the land could go to a soybean concern out of Champaign. There were tractors going for scrap prices, and a butter churn that fetched more than the tractors did, and a room full of depression glass that had the town wives elbowing each other in the ribs. And then there was the lantern, and nobody had wanted the lantern, and Vernon Hollis had lifted his finger once at 80 and walked away with it. Vernon was 68 years old. He was lean the way a fence post is lean, stooped a little through the shoulders from 41 years of leaning over a workbench, and his face was a map of small, weathered lines that ran down from his eyes and around his mouth like water finding the low places in a field. He wore a gray work cap that had gone soft at the brim, a chambray shirt buttoned to the second button, and a canvas jacket the color of old hay. His hands were the part of him that told the whole story. Big-knuckled, scarred across the backs from 100 small burns, the pads of his fingers thick and yellowed from a lifetime of holding hot metal and cold steel and the particular kind of file that a locksmith uses when he wants to feel the tumblers instead of hear them. Vernon had been the town locksmith and the town welder both, ever since he came home from Korea in 1954 and hung out a shingle over a garage bay on Front Street. 2 trades, 1 man, and he had never once advertised either of them. The laugh came again as Vernon walked past the back of the tent to fetch his dolly. It belonged to a man named Delbert Crane, who was 49 that spring, and heavy through the middle, clean-shaven, ruddy in the face, and dressed that morning in a mustard-colored sport coat with a gold chain sitting on his chest hair where his shirt was open 1 button too many. Delbert ran a used car lot on the east side of town called Crane's Clean Deals, and he had driven up to the auction in a white Cadillac Coupe de Ville that still had the dealer paper in the window. He had a way of standing with his hands on his hips and his elbows out wide, taking up more air than any one man needed. "Well, now," Delbert called across the tent, loud enough to make the clerk look up. "Well, now, if it ain't old Vernon buying himself a paperweight, $80 for a boat anchor. You going to use that to hold your barn door open, Vernon, or you just decorating the porch? A few men laughed. Most of the men there knew Vernon and knew better, but a few laughed because Delbert was loud, and because laughing along was easier than not. Vernon set the dolly next to the table and slid the lantern onto the lip of it and did not answer. He did not answer because he had learned a long time back that answering a man like Delbert Crane was the same as feeding a stray dog. Do it once, and you have got yourself a problem for life. What Vernon had seen, and what Delbert had not, was the weld. That fat, ugly bead running around the little wick door was not the work of a man closing something up for scrap. It was the work of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. The bead was even. The heat had been controlled, and the corners were tucked in tight the way only somebody who had welded pressure vessels or boiler seams would tuck them. And the weight. Vernon had lifted the lantern with one hand at the table and felt right away that whatever was inside it was not air. A cast-iron railroad lantern, empty, ought to weigh about 4 pounds. He rolled it out to his truck, an olive-green Ford from 1971 that had 240,000 miles on the odometer and a bed lined with plywood he had cut himself. He set the lantern in the bed on a folded feed sack so it would not slide, and he closed the tailgate, and he drove home the long way along the county road so he could think. Vernon had learned his welding from a man named Otis Pruitt, who had run the shop before him, and Otis had said one thing to Vernon on his first week that Vernon had never forgotten. "A weld is a man's handwriting in steel," Otis had said. "You can read a weld like you read a letter, if you know what letters are made of. And a man who welds something shut is telling you plain as speech that whatever is inside that seam." Vernon had thought about those words 100 times over 40 years, and he thought about them again on that slow drive home along the ditches full of standing water and the fields not yet turned. There is a kind of patience that looks like weakness, right up until the moment it doesn't. Vernon had lived his whole life on the far side of that line, and he did not much care what side of it other people thought he was on. He got home to his little house on the north edge of town just as the sun was going soft over the grain elevator, and he carried a lantern into his shop out behind the house, and he set it on the bench under the fluorescent tube and looked at it a good long while before he touched it again. He put a pot of coffee on the hot plate in the corner. He rolled up his sleeves, and he did not start cutting that night, no matter what the title of the story about him would later suggest. Vernon Hollis had never in his life started a job on the same day he brought it home. He looked, he measured, he wrote down what he saw in a little spiral notebook he kept on the bench. And then he went inside and ate a supper of cornbread and beans and slept 8 hours, the way a man sleeps who is not in a hurry. The next morning was a Sunday, and Reed's Junction being what it was, the story of Vernon's $80 boat anchor had already made it to the counter at the Skillet Cafe by the time the biscuits came out. Delbert Crane had told the story twice at the auction and 3 more times at the tavern that same night, and by Sunday breakfast every farmer with a coffee cup in his hand had heard some version of it. Old Vernon buying a welded shut lantern, old Vernon paying $80 for a lump of iron, old Vernon losing his last marble, and wasn't it a shame, and wasn't it funny, and past the syrup. A man named Ed Coombs, who had known Vernon since grade school and had helped him unload a hay wagon in 1962, stopped by the shop that Sunday afternoon on the excuse of buying a new key for his mailbox. He watched Vernon file the key blank for a minute, and then he said, "Vern, what in the world do you want with that thing you bought?" Vernon looked at the key and blew the brass shavings off it. "It'll open," he said. Ed nodded slowly. "That's what I figured you'd say," he said. And that was the whole conversation. Ed took his key and went home and told his wife that Vernon Hollis had bought the lantern for a reason, and if Delbert Crane wanted to laugh, then Delbert Crane could go on laughing. But Ed, for his own part, that was about the most defense Vernon ever got in Reed's Junction, and it was more than most men would have earned. Now, to understand the lantern, you have to go back 43 years to a night in November of 1943 when a man named August Barlow walked out of his farmhouse for the last time. August Barlow was the great-uncle of the estate being auctioned off that April, and in 1943 he was the station master at the Reed's Junction Rail Depot, a job he had held for 22 years. He was 56 then, a widower, quiet, a churchgoer, and by every account a man who kept his ledger straight and his platform swept. He had a daughter named Ruth, who was 19 and working as a nurse's aide down in Cairo. That November, there had been a robbery on the Illinois Central Line, a pay car coming north out of Carbondale, carrying the payroll for 3 separate quarry operations, had been broken into somewhere between Anna and Reed's Junction, and $11,400 in cash and negotiable notes had gone missing. The pay car had come through Reed's Junction at 2:14 in the morning on a scheduled water stop, and August Barlow had been the man on duty. He was the last railroad employee to have handled the pay car door before the theft was discovered up in Effingham. And when the railroad detectives came, and the county sheriff came, and the newspaper came, they all looked at August Barlow, and they all came to the same conclusion without ever quite saying it out loud. August Barlow was suspended from the railroad within a week. No charges were filed, because no evidence was found. But no charges needed to be filed for the town to know what the town had decided. He lost his pew at the church by way of nobody sitting next to him. He lost his standing at the feed store by way of nobody meeting his eye. And on the night of the 17th of December, 1943, August Barlow walked out to his tool shed behind the farmhouse and hanged himself from a crossbeam. His daughter Ruth came home from Cairo for the funeral and did not stay. She married a man named Fenton down in Kentucky the following spring and never came back to Reed's Junction, not for anything. The farm passed to a nephew, and the nephew to his widow, and the widow to the bank, and in all those years nobody had ever found the $11,400, and nobody had ever cleared August Barlow's name, because in a small town a name does not need a court to be convicted and does not need a court to be hanged. The lantern had been August Barlow's. It had hung on the wall of the station master's office for 22 years, and after his suspension, he had taken it home with him, and it had sat on a shelf in his kitchen for the 3 weeks between his suspension. Nobody at the estate sale had known any of that, because nobody at the estate sale had been alive in 1943 who cared to remember. Nobody except Vernon Hollis, who had been 25 years old that December and had delivered the coal to the Barlow house the week before August, died and had seen the old man sitting at his kitchen table with the lantern in front of him. Vernon had not thought about that kitchen in 43 years. But he had remembered it the moment he lifted the lantern at the auction and felt the weight of it, and he had remembered the shape of that fat, ugly well the moment he ran his thumb across it, because 43 years back he had watched August Barlow's hands hold a torch. And August Barlow had welded pressure lines for the Illinois Central for 18 years before he was ever a station master. A weld is a man's handwriting in steel, and Vernon Hollis had recognized the handwriting. He started work on the lantern that Monday evening after supper. He did not use a saw, and he did not use a torch, because he was not going to destroy what August Barlow had spent an evening protecting. He used a small angle grinder with a fine wheel, and he worked 1 millimeter at a time along the edge of the weld bead where the wick door met the frame. He wore his welding glasses pushed up on his forehead and his reading glasses down on his nose, and he stopped every 20 minutes to let the metal cool so the temper of it would not change and so that whatever was inside would not be harmed by the heat. He worked 3 hours that Monday and stopped at 10. He worked 4 hours Tuesday. He worked 5 hours Wednesday. And on Thursday evening, at 9:15, with a light rain falling on the tin roof of the shop, the little wick door of the lantern let go with a sound like a held breath finally letting go, and swung open on its old hinge as easy as if it had been made yesterday. Vernon set the grinder down and turned off the fluorescent tube overhead and turned on the small gooseneck lamp on the bench instead, because he did not want harsh light on whatever was about to come out of that lantern. He sat on his stool a long minute without touching it. He took his cap off and set it on the bench. Then he reached 2 fingers into the wick door and drew out what was inside. There were 3 things. The first was a canvas pouch, oiled and folded tight, and inside the canvas pouch were the $11,400 in 20s and 50s and a few $100 notes, wrapped in wax paper and banded with the original Illinois Central paper bands, stamped with the date November 1943. Not one bill was missing. Not one had been spent. The second was a small brown envelope sealed with wax, and inside the envelope was a signed and dated affidavit from a man named Harlan Vance, who had been the assistant station master in 1943, admitting in his own hand that he had taken the payroll from the pay car and let August Barlow take the fall for the theft. The affidavit was dated the 9th of December 1943, and it was signed at the bottom, and beneath the signature Harlan Vance had written the words, "I did this because I was afraid, and August did not deserve what happened to him, and God forgive me." The third was a letter in August Barlow's own hand, addressed on the outside to whoever opens this. Vernon put on his reading glasses and read it slowly once through in the yellow light of the gooseneck lamp. The letter said, "To whoever opens this, my name is August Barlow, and I have been accused of a thing I did not do." Harlan Vance came to my kitchen on the evening of the 6th of December and confessed to me what he had done, and he gave me the money and the paper you have found with this letter, and he asked me what he ought to do. I told him he ought to go to the sheriff, and he said he would, and he went out my door, and he did not go to the sheriff, and I have not seen him since. I know he will not go. I know I will be blamed until I die of it, and I feel that day coming soon, because a man cannot carry this kind of shame in a town that has already decided about him. I am putting the money and the paper inside my old station lantern, and I am welding it shut, so that when the truth is ready to come out, it will come out on its own time and not on mine. I do not want my Ruth to know until she is old enough not to be ruined by it. Whoever you are that opens this, please see that the money is returned to the Illinois Central Railroad, and please see that the paper is delivered to my daughter, Ruth Barlow, who I hope is still living, and please tell her that her father was an honest man, and that he loved her, and that he was sorry he could not stay. Signed, August Barlow, the 15th of December, 1943. Vernon read the letter a second time, and then he folded it back into its envelope, and he sat on his stool for a long while, with his hands flat on the bench and his eyes closed, and outside the rain kept up its small, steady sound on the tin roof. He could have kept it. He was 68 years old, and he had $11,400 sitting in front of him in cash that had not been circulated in 43 years. And the man it belonged to had been dead longer than most of the people in town had been alive. And the railroad it had been stolen from had merged twice and changed its name and would not even know how to receive a return. He could have kept it, and no one would ever have known. He could have burned the letter and the affidavit and lived the last of his years in a way he had never lived any of the first of them. He did not consider it for as long as it takes to tell you. He did not consider it. Vernon Hollis put the money back in the canvas pouch and the pouch back in the lantern, and he put the affidavit and the letter into a manila envelope from his desk, and he went inside and made a pot of coffee, and in what order, and how to do it in a way that would cause the least amount of noise and the greatest amount of good. Ruth Barlow Fenton was, it turned out, still living. She was 62 years old and a widow, and she lived in a small brick house outside Paducah, Kentucky, and she worked part-time at a dry cleaner's. Vernon drove down there the next Saturday in his old Ford truck with the manila envelope on the seat beside him and the canvas pouch in a lockbox under the seat, and he knocked on her door at 10 in the morning, and when she answered, he took off his cap and told her his name and told her he had known her father, because he had something to tell her that was going to take a little time. He read her the letter. He showed her the affidavit. He gave her the canvas pouch and told her the money was hers to return to the railroad, or hers to keep, whichever her conscience preferred, but that her father had asked for it to go back, and that her father, in Vernon's opinion, had been a man whose asks were worth honoring. He did not stay for lunch, though she offered. He drove home the same day and got back to Reed's Junction after midnight and slept until noon on Sunday, for the first time in his adult life. Ruth Barlow Fenton returned the money to what was left of the Illinois Central by way of a lawyer in Paducah, and she gave the affidavit to a reporter at the Cairo newspaper, and by the following Friday, the story had run in 3 counties, and by the Friday after that it had run in Springfield and Chicago. Harlan Vance had been dead since 1961, but his signature was on the paper, and the paper spoke for itself, and the railroad issued a formal statement clearing August Barlow's name 43 years after he had hanged himself in his tool shed. The town of Reed's Junction did not know quite what to do with itself for about a month. The pew at the Methodist church that August Barlow had once sat in was left empty for a full Sunday, on purpose by way of apology, and a small brass plaque was put up on the wall of the old depot, which by then was a historical society office. And the lantern itself was placed in a glass case on a shelf beneath the plaque with a card that told the whole story in 6 short paragraphs. Delbert Crane said very little. He was seen at the Skillet Cafe the morning the story ran, and he did not open his newspaper at the counter the way he usually did, and he did not tell any jokes for a good long while. And within 2 years his car lot had gone under. Vernon Hollis went back to his shop. He cut keys and he welded trailer hitches, and he did not talk about the lantern, not to Ed Coombs, Not to anybody? On summer evenings, sometimes he would drive by the old depot after supper, and he would park across the street under the elm tree, and he would sit in his truck a minute and look at the lit window where the lantern sat in its glass case on its shelf. And then he would put the truck in gear and drive home the long way past the ditches and the fields. And he would sleep the sleep of a man who has done what he came to do. So I will leave it with you. If you had lifted that lantern off the auction table and felt the weight of it in your hand, and if you had carried it home and cut it open and found what Vernon Hollis found sitting inside it, would you have driven to Paducah the next Saturday with the pouch on the seat beside you? Dada, would you have shut the shop door and counted the bills and told yourself that a dead man does not need his name back as bad as a living man needs $11,400?